Every sword fight you have ever seen in a movie ends the same way. The hero's blade snaps. The fight is over. A broken sword is a death sentence, a symbol of defeat, the moment everything goes wrong. Medieval combat masters wrote the exact opposite into their training manuals. A shorter blade did not end the fight. In specific conditions, it started a completely different one, when the fighter with the full-length sword was structurally unprepared to survive. This is not mythology. It is documented physics, and it dismantles everything you thought you knew about what makes a sword dangerous. The range trap. Here's the assumption nobody questions. Longer blade equals more dangerous fighter. More reach, more threat, more control over the engagement. This is true at exactly one distance and completely false everywhere else. Every sword has an optimal engagement range, the distance from which the weapon delivers maximum force with maximum control. For a long sword, that range sits at roughly arm's length plus blade length. Strike from there and the physics work perfectly. Forward mass distribution concentrates force toward the tip. The swing arc is wide enough to generate momentum. The recovery gives you time to reset. Step inside that range and everything inverts. The sword becomes too long to maneuver in tight space. A swing that started at optimal range cannot be redirected once it commits. The rotational inertia that made the blow powerful now works against the fighter, carrying the blade past the target with no capacity to change course. Recovery time, the gap between one attack and the next, stretches out, and inside that gap, the opponent who has already closed distance has nothing in their way. Medieval fighters understood this completely. The entire German school of swordsmanship, codified by Johannes Lichtenauer in the 14th century and preserved in multiple surviving manuscripts, is built around one principle: collapse the distance, get inside your opponent's measure, and their weapon stops functioning as designed. A shortened blade, whether broken or deliberately gripped shorter, starts the fight already inside that measure. The fighter holding it does not need to close distance. They are already there. And the fighter with the full-length sword is holding a weapon optimized for a range that no longer exists. What the manuals actually say. This is where the evidence becomes impossible to argue against. Hans Talhofer's Fechtbuch, a 15th century German fencing manual with a surviving 16th century copy in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, contains detailed illustrations of exactly what happens when combat collapses to close quarters. The technique is called Mordhau, the murder stroke. A fighter grips their own blade with both hands and strikes with the pommel and crossguard as a bludgeoning weapon, delivering hammer blows to an armored opponent's helmet and joints. Read that again. Medieval combat masters taught fighters to deliberately stop using their blade entirely and weaponize the hilt, not as a last resort, as a primary technique specifically developed for armored combat. The blade became irrelevant the moment distance collapsed. The steel pommel and heavy crossguard, concentrated mass at the end of a controlled lever, became the actual weapon. The half-sword technique, documented in sources including the anonymous Gladiatoria manuscript from the 1430s and 1450s, goes further still. A fighter grips the blade of their own longsword with one mailed hand, midway down the blade, and uses the shortened configuration as a precise thrusting spear with 2 points of directional control. Historical fencing manuals show this technique used in the majority of armored combat scenarios, not occasionally. Most medieval treatises show armored combat as consisting primarily of fighting at the half-sword, targeting gaps at the visor, armpit, and throat. Crucially, some long swords were manufactured with this in mind. Certain blades were deliberately left unsharpened along a section near the midpoint, a feature confirmed by the Italian fencing master Filippo Vadi, specifically to make half-swording safer and more effective. The weapon was designed to be used at half its length. Both techniques share one underlying physics principle. The full length of the blade was not always the advantage. In specific conditions, reducing effective blade length made the weapon more dangerous, not less. The physics of shortened steel. Here is what actually changes when effective blade length drops dramatically. A longsword's moment of inertia, its resistance to rotational change, scales with how far mass sits from the pivot point at the grip. The further forward the mass, the harder the blade is to start moving, stop moving, and redirect mid-movement. This forward mass distribution is intentional for long-range combat. It concentrates striking force toward the tip. It creates the momentum that makes a full swing devastating. Inside close quarters, that same moment of inertia becomes a physical trap. Starting a swing costs time. Stopping a swing costs more time. Redirecting a committed swing is nearly impossible. Against an opponent who has already closed the distance, the rotational commitment of a full-length blade leaves gaps between attacks that a shorter weapon can exploit repeatedly before any recovery is possible. When a fighter grips their blade at the midpoint for half-swording, the effective moment of inertia of the working portion of the weapon drops substantially. The shortened configuration responds faster. faster. Direction changes happen with less effort and less committed art. Two hands controlling 2 points along the weapon, one at the grip and one on the blade, give the fighter precise directional control that a single grip point cannot match. The Mordhau takes this further by essentially eliminating the blade from the physics equation entirely. Both hands grip the blade, concentrating control near the crossguard. The striking element becomes the pommel, typically a dense steel sphere or disc sitting as close to the hands as possible. Moment of inertia approaches its minimum. Strike initiation is fast, recovery is immediate, and the concussive force delivered to plate armor or an unprotected head does not require blade geometry to be lethal. The armor problem that made all of this inevitable. This is the context that explains why shortened blade techniques were not clever alternatives. They were necessary responses to a material reality. From the 14th century onward, quality plate armor made cutting with a sword against an armored opponent functionally useless. A full power swing of a longsword delivered its energy into hardened steel plate that redirected it. The blade skated across the surface. The armor dented slightly, if at all. The fighter who swung was now in recovery, while their armored opponent was not. The entire logic of long blade cutting combat collapsed against plate, and the combat masters documented in surviving feck books responded by systematically abandoning it in armored scenarios. Half-swording became the default configuration for armored combat. Mordhau became standard technique. The sword stopped functioning as a sword and started functioning as a short lever, a precision thrusting tool, and a bludgeon. A broken sword leaving a fighter with 50 to 60 centimeters of blade was not a disadvantage in this context. It was approximately the effective working length that trained fighters deliberately created through half-swording by choice. The key difference was intent and training. A trained fighter chose to shorten deliberately and knew exactly what close-quarters techniques to apply. An untrained fighter with a broken sword arrived at the same geometry by accident, without the system to exploit it. But here's what that means for their opponent. The fighter with a full-length sword was not trained to fight someone at half-sword range who was not using half-sword technique. The broken sword created a range problem their opponent had no prepared answer for: the psychological collapse. There is one final dimension that the manuals do not document, but the physics of human perception makes almost certain. A fighter who watches an opponent's blade snap registers an immediate category shift. The threat level drops in their assessment. Their brain processes damaged weapon as reduced danger. They press forward with more confidence, less caution, shorter reaction times dedicated to defense. They close distance. They enter the range where the shortened blade's advantages in moment of inertia and directional control are highest. They abandon the measure where their full-length blade was dominant, and they do it voluntarily, driven by a psychological signal that the physics were about to contradict. The most dangerous transition in any fight is when one side believes they have already won. Overconfidence does not make fighters faster or more precise. It makes them less careful about range management, less disciplined about timing, and less responsive to changes in the actual threat geometry in front of them. What this actually reveals: the broken sword scenario is not really about broken swords. It never was. It is about a principle that Lichtenhauer's entire tradition understood and encoded into systematic training. Optimal range is not fixed. A weapon optimized for one distance is a liability at another. The fighter who transitions between ranges faster than their opponent controls the fight, regardless of what their weapon looks like at any given moment. Half-swording, Mordhau, and the entire close-quarters arsenal of the German fencing tradition were built on this exact principle. The blade was one tool among several housed in the same weapon. The pommel was a tool. The crossguard was a tool. The grip position along the blade was a variable, not a fixed point. Some blades were even manufactured with unsharpened sections specifically so the blade itself could be safely gripped in combat. A broken sword forces a fighter into close quarters range by removing the choice to stay at distance. For an untrained fighter, that is genuinely a death sentence. For a fighter who understands that close quarters is where the Mordhau lives, where the half-sword thrust finds armor gaps, where rotational inertia no longer protects the opponent, it is not a disadvantage. The physics was never about blade length. It was always about who understood what the distance actually meant, and sometimes the fighter who lost half their sword was the one who finally got close enough to end it.